In the deepest reaches of the Shadow Realm, where mountains bled black smoke into a sky that never saw daylight, there stood a fortress carved from obsidian and old sorrow. This was Keep, seat of the demon Lord Malachar, ruler of the Nine Circles and last heir to a bloodline older than the stars themselves. He had worn the crown for 3 centuries, and in that time he had learned that power, however vast, could not fill the hollow place inside a man who had outlived everyone he loved. Malachar was not born cruel, few of his kind truly were. Cruelty, he often thought, was simply what remained when hope had been burned away too many times. His father had been a tyrant, his mother a memory he could barely summon, and the throne he now occupied had cost him every soft thing he once carried in his heart. What remained was discipline, control, and a quiet, simmering loneliness that no subject dared to notice, let alone speak of. The demons who served him respected him, feared him, perhaps even admired him from a careful distance, but none of them knew him. How could they? A king who reveals his wounds becomes a king who can be struck there. Malachar had learned this lesson early when trust had once cost him nearly everything. So he ruled with a still face and a steady hand, and he told himself on the nights when the silence in his chambers grew too loud that this was simply the price of what he was. It was on one such night that the prophecy stirred to life again. The seers of his court had spoken of it for generations, though most had dismissed it as an old superstition, a tale told to frighten young demons into obedience. The prophecy of the Chosen One. It said that when the veil between realms grew thin, a soul would emerge, untouched by demon blood, who held the power either to shatter the demon lord's throne forever or to stand beside him and end the curse that had haunted his bloodline since its very first king. No one knew which outcome fate intended. Not even the oldest of the seers could say with certainty. All they agreed upon was this: the Chosen One was coming, and when they arrived, the demon lord's life would never be the same again. Malachar had heard this prophecy so many times throughout his long life that he had stopped truly listening to it. He had watched false chosen ones rise and fall, ordinary souls mistaken for destiny simply because the timing suited someone's ambition. He had grown skeptical of fate itself, believing instead in the things he could control: his armies, his borders, the careful balance of power between the realms. Prophecies, he had decided, were for those who lacked the strength to shape their own future. And yet on this particular night, something shifted. He felt it first as a tremor beneath his skin, subtle as a change in wind before a storm. The ancient mark upon his chest, dormant since his coronation, began to burn faintly, a symbol passed down through every ruler of his line, said to awaken only in the presence of true fate. He rose from his throne and pressed a hand to his chest, startled by the warmth spreading beneath his palm. For the first time in longer than he cared to admit, uncertainty crept into his thoughts. He summoned his most trusted advisor, an ancient sorceress named Usold, who had served 3 generations of his family and had never once lied to him. She arrived swiftly, her robes trailing shadows across the stone floor, her eyes sharp despite the weight of centuries behind them. "The mark has stirred," Malachar said without preamble. He rarely wasted words, even with those he trusted. Usold's expression did not change, though something flickered behind her gaze. "Then it has finally happened, my lord. The Chosen One has crossed into our world." Malachar turned toward the tall window of his chamber, staring out at the endless dark horizon where lightning flickered without rain. "You sound certain." "I am certain of very little," Usold admitted, "but the mark does not lie. It has waited 300 years to wake. It would not do so now without reason." He said nothing for a long moment, his mind turning over possibilities he had refused to entertain for decades. If the prophecy was true, then somewhere within his realm, or perhaps just beyond its borders, walked a soul bound to his fate by forces older than either of them. A soul who might end his reign, or end the isolation that had shaped every waking hour of his long, long life. "Find them," he finally said, quietly. "I will not have my court whispering of destiny before I understand what it means." Usold bowed and departed, leaving Malachar alone with his thoughts and the faint, persistent warmth still glowing beneath his chest. He did not sleep that night, though sleep was rarely something his kind required. Instead, he stood upon the highest balcony of Keep, watching the horizon as though he might see the answer written across it. He thought of his father, who had scoffed at prophecy his entire life and died believing only in strength. He thought of his mother, whose gentle nature had made her an easy target in a court built on cruelty. He wondered, not for the first time, what kind of demon he might have become had fate never burdened him with a crown so heavy it had crushed every softer part of him. 3 days passed before Usald returned with news. She found him in the war room poring over maps of the border territories where the veil between worlds had grown thinnest. "We found traces," she said, "a human village near the Whisperwood close to where the veil tore during the last eclipse. Something crossed there, my lord, something that should not exist in our realm yet does." "A human," Malachar said quietly, more statement than question. "It would seem so, untouched by demon blood, exactly as the old texts describe." He felt something tighten in his chest, though he could not name whether it was dread or anticipation. A human wandering lost in a realm built from centuries of darkness and cruelty. If the prophecy held true, this fragile soul carried the power to end him, or to save him from a solitude he had long since stopped believing could ever be broken. "Bring them to me," he said at last. "Alive, unharmed, I will see this chosen one myself before I decide what their fate or mine will become." Usald hesitated, an unusual gesture for a sorceress who rarely questioned his commands. "And if they refuse to come, my lord?" Malachar's eyes darkened, ancient power stirring behind his calm exterior like embers beneath ash. "Then I will go to them myself. Fate has waited 300 years to test me, Usald. I do not intend to let it wait a moment longer." As she left to carry out his orders, Malachar remained alone once more, staring at the map spread before him, tracing the path toward the Whisperwood with a finger that trembled just slightly for the first time in longer than he could remember. Somewhere beyond the borders of his kingdom, a stranger walked unaware, carrying within them a destiny that would soon collide with his own. Whether that collision would bring salvation or ruin, even he could not yet say. But for the first time in 300 years, the demon Lord Malachar felt something he had almost forgotten how to recognize. Not fear precisely, though there was a thread of that woven through it. It was closer to hope, fragile and unfamiliar, stirring quietly beneath the weight of the crown he had carried for so long alone. And in the deepest reaches of the Shadow Realm, as thunder rolled without rain and the ancient mark upon his chest continued its slow, steady burn, the wheels of fate turned once more, carrying him toward a meeting 3 centuries in the making. The Whisperwood earned its name from the way its trees seemed to murmur secrets to one another whenever the wind passed through their twisted branches. It was a place where the veil between worlds had always run thin, where farmers avoided their fields after dusk and children were taught to stay indoors when the moon turned the color of rust. Malachar had visited the region only a handful of times in his long reign, and always with unease, for even a demon lord could feel the strangeness of a place where two realities pressed too closely against each other. He arrived at the edge of the forest with a small retinue, having chosen to keep his presence discreet rather than announce himself with the full pageantry his position demanded. Usald walked beside him, her staff glowing faintly to ward off the creatures that lurked in the deeper shadows, while 2 of his most trusted guards trailed a respectful distance behind. Malachar had cloaked himself in a simpler form than his true nature, tall and dark-haired, with eyes that still betrayed a faint crimson glow no illusion could fully hide. The village Usald had spoken of sat just beyond the tree lane, a cluster of modest homes surrounded by fields gone fallow with fear. Word had already spread among the villagers of strange happenings, lights in the sky, animals fleeing en masse, and a stranger who had appeared from nowhere 3 nights past, collapsed at the edge of the well with no memory of how they had come to be there. Malachar found her in the small home of the village healer, an elderly woman who regarded his approach with the particular wariness only those who had lived near the Whisperwood their whole lives seemed to possess. She did not know what stood before her, not truly, but something in her instincts recognized danger, and she stepped aside without being asked. The chosen one was a young woman named Elira, though he would not learn her name until later. She lay upon a narrow cot, dark hair damp with fever sweat, her breathing shallow but steady. When Malachar entered the room, something within him stirred violently, the mark upon his chest flaring with heat so intense he nearly staggered. Usald noticed and said nothing, though her eyes widened slightly at the sight. He approached slowly, studying her features with a curiosity he had not allowed himself to feel in decades. There was nothing extraordinary about her appearance, nothing that marked her as the bearer of a destiny capable of unmaking kings. She looked simply human, tired, frightened even in sleep, and utterly unaware of the storm gathering around her fate. When her eyes finally opened, they found his immediately, as though some invisible thread had drawn her gaze straight to him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. She stared at him with a mixture of confusion and instinctive alarm, her body tensing beneath the thin blanket covering her. "Where am I?" she finally asked, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Somewhere far from wherever you called home," Malachar answered, his tone carefully measured. "Do you remember how you arrived here?" She shook her head slowly. "There was light, a storm maybe, I remember running from something but I can't recall what, then nothing until I woke here." Her gaze sharpened as she studied him more closely, taking in details that did not quite fit with the modest room around them, the strange authority in his posture, the way even the healer avoided meeting his eyes. "Who are you?" He considered lying, considered offering some gentler introduction that might ease her into the truth. But 300 years of ruling had taught him that deception rarely served anyone well in the long run, least of all when dealing with forces as significant as fate itself. "My name is Malachar," he said simply. "I am the demon lord of this realm, and if the old prophecies hold true, you are the soul bound to my fate by powers neither of us chose." Whatever reaction he expected, it was not the sharp, disbelieving laugh that escaped her, quickly swallowed by a wince of pain from her fevered body. "A demon lord," she repeated. "Of course, why not? I've already accepted I'm clearly losing my mind." "You are not losing your mind," Usald interjected gently from the doorway, "though I understand the difficulty in accepting what you now face." Over the following days, as Illyria's strength slowly returned, Malachar found himself drawn into conversations he had not anticipated having with anyone, let alone a human stranger from beyond the veil. She was sharp-witted despite her fear, asking questions that cut straight to matters he preferred to avoid, questioning the nature of his realm, his rule, and eventually the prophecy that had brought them together. "So what happens now?" she asked one evening as they sat in the small garden behind the healer's home, the twisted trees of the whisperwood whispering softly beyond the fence. "Am I meant to destroy you or save you? Because frankly, neither option sounds particularly appealing right now." Malachar allowed himself a rare, small smile at her bluntness. "The prophecy does not specify. It simply states that our fates are bound and that the choice will ultimately rest with you." "That seems like a poorly written prophecy." "Most prophecies are," he admitted. "They are written by those who see fragments of the future, never the whole picture. The rest is left for those who must live it." She studied him for a long moment, her earlier fear giving way slowly to something more thoughtful. "You don't seem like what I expected a demon lord to be." "And what did you expect?" "Someone crueler, I suppose, more monstrous." Something in his chest tightened at her words, an old wound reopening despite the years that should have healed it. "I have been cruel," he said quietly, "more times than I care to admit. Power such as mine does not stay clean for long." "But you're not cruel now." He considered this carefully before answering. "Perhaps that is because, for the first time in a very long while, I find myself wanting to be something other than what my crown demands of me." The days that followed brought them closer, despite the impossible circumstances binding their fates together. Illyria learned of his realm's history, the centuries of conflict between demons and humans, the curse that had plagued his bloodline since its first king had made a desperate bargain to save his people. Malachar in turn learned of her world, simpler in some ways yet carrying its own quiet sorrows, a family lost too young, a life spent searching for purpose she had never quite found. But not everyone within his court welcomed this growing bond. Word of the Chosen One's arrival spread quickly among the demon nobility, and not all of them believed a human girl should hold such influence over their king. Chief among the skeptics was Lord Keith, a powerful general whose ambitions had long simmered beneath a mask of loyalty. He arrived at Vorithkeep, demanding an audience within a fortnight of Illyria's discovery, his expression carefully neutral, though Malachar had known him long enough to recognize the calculation behind his eyes. "My lord," Keith said, bowing with practiced precision, "the court grows uneasy. Rumors spread of a human sheltered within these walls, one said to carry power over your very fate. Surely you understand the danger such rumors pose to your authority." "The prophecy is not rumor," Malachar replied evenly. "It is truth confirmed by Usald herself." Truth or not, my lord, our people have suffered too long under threat from the human realms. To see their king bound to one of them, however the prophecy frames it, will not sit easily with many. Malachar studied the general carefully, weighing the warning beneath his words. Are you suggesting rebellion, Keith? I am suggesting caution, Keith replied smoothly. Nothing more, though I would remind you that not every threat to your throne comes wrapped in prophecy. Some walk your own halls wearing familiar faces. The warning lingered long after Keith departed, settling uneasily in Malachar's thoughts as he made his way back toward the chambers where Illyra had been given quarters befitting a guest of significance, if not yet full understanding of what her presence truly meant for his realm. He found her by the window, staring out at the smoke-veiled mountains with an expression caught between wonder and unease. Your general doesn't trust me, she said without turning, having clearly overheard enough of the earlier conversation through the corridor. Keith trusts very little beyond his own ambition, Malachar replied, moving to stand beside her, but he is not entirely wrong to be cautious. Our peoples have fought for centuries. Your presence here challenges old wounds that have never fully healed. And what about your wounds? She asked, finally turning to face him. Does my presence challenge those too? He held her gaze, feeling the mark upon his chest warm gently beneath his robes, a quiet reminder of the fate binding them together whether either of them fully understood it yet. More than you know, he admitted softly, more than I am entirely comfortable with. Outside, thunder rolled once more across the smoke-dark sky, and somewhere within the depths of Vorith Keep, old alliances began quietly shifting, as those who feared the prophecy's fulfillment started weighing exactly how far they might go to prevent it. Winter came slowly to the Shadow Realm, marked not by falling snow but by a deepening chill that seemed to settle into the very stones of Vorith Keep. Illyra had now spent 3 months within its walls, and in that time, the fortress that once felt like a prison to her had gradually transformed into something closer to an uneasy home. She had learned the rhythms of demon court life, the careful politics whispered behind closed doors, and the particular weight that settled over every room Malachar entered, a mixture of respect and fear that she had come to understand was simply the price of his power. Their bond had deepened in ways neither of them had anticipated when fate first drew them together. What began as wary curiosity had grown into something far more complicated, conversations stretching late into the night, quiet moments shared in the fortress gardens where strange dark flowers bloomed despite the absence of sunlight. Malachar found himself confiding in her truths he had shared with no one else, memories of his mother's gentle voice, the crushing loneliness of his coronation, the weight of ruling a realm built upon centuries of cruelty he had never fully chosen for himself. In turn, Illyra shared her own history, the family she had lost to illness when she was barely 16, the years spent drifting through a life that never quite felt like her own, the strange sense of purpose she had begun to feel here, however impossible her circumstances remained. There was comfort in their shared understanding of loneliness, even as the shadow of prophecy hung constantly between them, an unanswered question neither dared examine too closely. But not everyone within the court shared their growing peace. Lord Keith's warnings had not faded with time, if anything they had sharpened into something more dangerous. Whispers moved through Vorith Keep's corridors like smoke, carried by nobles who feared what the Chosen One's presence might mean for the traditions that had sustained demon rule for centuries. Some believed Illyra meant to weaken their king from within, a human agent sent to unravel everything their kind had built. Others feared she might succeed where countless assassins had failed, ending Malachar's reign not through violence, but through some subtler dissolution of the strength that had always defined him. Usold, ever watchful, brought these concerns to Malachar one evening as autumn gave way fully to winter's chill. The whispers grow louder, my lord. Keith has been meeting privately with several of the border lords. I do not yet know what they discuss, but I suspect it bodes poorly for the peace you've found. Malachar absorbed this news with the careful stillness he had cultivated over centuries of rule, though something colder than winter settled in his chest at her words. Let them whisper. I will not abandon the path fate has set before me simply because old fools fear change. With respect, my lord, this is more than mere whispering. Keith commands significant loyalty among the Eastern legions. Should he choose to act against the crown, the consequences could reach far beyond simple court politics. He understood the warning for what it was, yet found himself unwilling to retreat from the fragile trust he had built with Illyra, however dangerous the circumstances surrounding it had become. Then we will need to be prepared for whatever Keith intends, but I will not sacrifice her safety nor abandon what we have found together, simply to appease those too frightened to accept a changing world. The confrontation, when it finally came, arrived with the particular cruelty of betrayal wearing a familiar face. Keith requested a private audience under the guise of discussing border defenses, and Malachar, though wary, granted it, believing the strength of his own position sufficient to weather whatever challenge the general intended to raise. He was wrong. Keith arrived not alone but flanked by a dozen loyal soldiers, their expressions grim with the particular determination of those who believed themselves justified in whatever violence they intended to commit. "My lord," Keith began, his earlier pretense of respect entirely abandoned, "I have tolerated your indulgence of this human girl for the sake of court unity, but unity has its limits and you have pushed us well beyond them." "Choose your next words carefully, Keith," Malachar warned, power gathering visibly around him, shadows deepening in the corners of the chamber as centuries of restrained strength stirred beneath his calm exterior. "I have chosen them already," Keith replied coldly. "The Eastern legions no longer recognize your authority while you remain bound to this prophecy. We will not watch our king weakened by human sentiment, nor risk our realm's future on the uncertain promises of an old superstition. Step aside, my lord, and allow someone stronger to lead our people forward." The betrayal cut deeper than Malachar cared to admit, not because he had trusted Keith completely, but because he recognized in the general's words the same fear that had shaped his own father's cruelty generations before. Fear of change, fear of vulnerability, fear that gentleness might somehow prove fatal to their kind's survival. It was a fear he had carried himself for centuries, until Illyra's presence had begun, slowly and carefully, to loosen its grip upon his heart. "You mistake compassion for weakness," Malachar said quietly, though his voice carried through the chamber with unmistakable authority. "A mistake my father made as well, and one that cost him everything in the end." Keith's expression hardened further. "Then perhaps it is time our bloodline learned a different lesson." The battle that followed tested every ounce of strength Malachar had accumulated across 3 centuries of rule. Keith's soldiers, though skilled, proved no match for a demon lord fighting not merely for his throne, but for the fragile hope he had only recently allowed himself to feel. Yet even as he fought, worry gnawed at him, for Illyra remained elsewhere in the fortress, unaware of the violence unfolding, vulnerable should any of Keith's allies think to use her against him. His fears proved justified. As he finally overcame the last of Keith's soldiers, Usold arrived breathless, her expression tight with alarm. "My lord, Illyra has been taken." Keith's supporters seized her during the confusion, hoping to use her as leverage against you. The rage that surged through Malachar in that moment was unlike anything he had felt in centuries, a fury born not from wounded pride, but from genuine fear for someone whose safety had somehow become as important to him as his own survival. Where have they taken her? The old watchtower near the eastern border. Keith himself leads them there. Malachar moved without hesitation, calling upon reserves of power he rarely allowed himself to fully unleash, shadows bending to his will as he traveled swiftly across the darkened landscape toward the tower where Illyra's fate, and quite possibly his own, now hung suspended in dangerous balance. He arrived to find Keith waiting atop the tower's highest platform, Illyra held firmly at his side, her expression defiant despite the obvious fear in her eyes. "I wondered how quickly you would come," Keith called out as Malachar landed upon the platform, power crackling visibly around him like storm clouds given form. "Release her, Keith, this quarrel is between us alone." "Is it?" Keith's laugh held little humor. "I think not, my lord. She is the very reason our realm now stands divided. Perhaps if she were to simply disappear, this troublesome prophecy might finally lose its hold over you." Illyra, despite her fear, met Malachar's gaze steadily, and in that look he found something that steadied his own racing heart, a trust neither of them had expected to develop, yet which now felt as essential as the ancient mark burning steadily upon his chest. "Don't listen to him," she said quietly. Whatever happens, don't let fear decide this for you. Her words settled something within him, clarifying a truth he had perhaps always known but never fully embraced. The prophecy had never been about choosing between destruction and salvation as separate, distant outcomes. It had always been about choice itself, about whether he would allow fear to dictate his path, as his father had, or whether he might finally forge something different, guided instead by the fragile, precious trust now standing between them. "You are wrong, Keith," Malachar said finally, his voice carrying absolute certainty despite the danger surrounding them. "This prophecy was never a threat to weaken me. It has shown me exactly what strength truly means." What followed was swift and decisive. Malachar's power, fueled by clarity rather than fear, overwhelmed Keith's remaining resistance within moments, the general's ambitions collapsing as thoroughly as the illusions of weakness he had projected onto his king. As dawn broke slowly over the eastern horizon, painting the smoke-dark sky with unfamiliar streaks of grey light, Malachar finally allowed himself to breathe, Illyra safe beside him, the immediate danger finally past. But as they returned to Vorith Keep, both of them understood that greater challenges still awaited, for the prophecy's true resolution had not yet been written, and the final choice, whatever form it might take, still remained suspended somewhere in their shared, uncertain future. The weeks following Keith's betrayal brought significant change to Vorith Keep, though not without considerable cost. Several of the Eastern legions had indeed rebelled, forcing Malachar into a series of difficult campaigns to restore order across his realm's borders. Illyra, despite the danger, refused to remain sheltered within the fortress walls, insisting instead on accompanying him whenever circumstances allowed, her presence becoming, gradually, a stabilizing influence not only for Malachar himself, but for a court still uncertain how to interpret the prophecy unfolding before them. It was during this period of rebuilding that Usold finally revealed the fuller truth behind the ancient prophecy, information she had uncovered while researching the oldest texts within the fortress archives. She summoned both Malachar and Illyra to her private chambers one evening, her expression carrying the particular gravity of someone about to share knowledge long buried by time. "I have found the original inscription," she began, unrolling an ancient scroll across her worn wooden table, its edges brittle with age. "The prophecy as passed down through generations has always been incomplete, simplified perhaps to make it easier to remember, or perhaps deliberately obscured by those who feared its full implications." "What does it truly say?" Malachar asked, studying the archaic symbols he could barely decipher despite his centuries of accumulated knowledge. "It speaks not merely of destruction or salvation, but of transformation," Usold explained. "The curse placed upon your bloodline generations ago was never meant to be permanent, my lord. It was designed with an escape woven into its very foundation, a path toward breaking the cycle entirely, but only if a demon king proved willing to embrace vulnerability rather than reject it as weakness." Illyra leaned forward, studying the ancient text with growing understanding. "So the choice was never about whether I would destroy him or save him specifically. It was about whether he would allow himself to be changed by someone outside his own kind." "Precisely," Usold confirmed. "The original curse bound each demon king to isolation, believing strength required the absence of vulnerability. But true strength, according to this original inscription, was always meant to be found in the courage to remain open despite the risks such openness carries." Malachar absorbed this revelation slowly, memories flooding back of his father's bitter isolation, the countless generations of his bloodline who had ruled through fear and distance rather than genuine connection. The curse, he now understood, had never simply been an external force acting upon his family. It had been a pattern perpetuated by choice after choice, generation after generation, each king reinforcing the same walls his predecessors had built before him. "Then breaking it requires," he began, though Usold finished the thought for him. "It requires you to choose differently, my lord, to allow the bond between yourself and Illyra to reach its natural completion, rather than retreating into old patterns of fear and control." The implications settled heavily upon both of them, for completing such a bond meant far more than simple companionship or shared trust. It meant merging their fates entirely, an irreversible joining that would forever alter the nature of demon rule within the realm, and quite possibly alter Illyria's own humanity in ways neither of them could fully predict. What would happen to her? Malachar asked quietly, his concern for Illyria's well-being overshadowing even his interest in breaking the curse that had haunted his family for centuries. Usald hesitated before answering. The texts are unclear on this point, my lord. She would likely gain abilities beyond typical human capacity, perhaps even something approaching immortality to match your own extended lifespan, but there is no certainty in ancient magic such as this. The transformation carries genuine risk. Illyria, who had remained quiet throughout much of this revelation, finally spoke, her voice steady despite the uncertainty surrounding them. And if I refuse, what happens to the curse to Malachar if I choose not to complete this bond? Then the prophecy remains unfulfilled, Usald said simply. The curse continues, and Malachar's reign continues much as it always has, marked by strength, but also by the isolation that has defined his bloodline since its very beginning. That night, Malachar found Illyria alone in the fortress gardens, standing beneath the strange dark blossoms that had somehow become one of her favorite places within his realm. She turned as he approached, her expression thoughtful rather than fearful, though the weight of the choice before them clearly occupied her thoughts as much as his own. You don't have to decide anything tonight, he said softly, settling beside her among the fragrant shadows. This choice should never be made from obligation, whatever the prophecy demands. I know, she replied, meeting his gaze steadily, but I think I've already made my choice, Malachar. I made it somewhere between the fear I felt when I first woke in this realm and the trust I feel now standing here with you. His chest tightened with an emotion he had rarely allowed himself across 3 centuries of careful rule, something far more vulnerable than the calculated confidence he projected before his court. Illyria, the risks. Are risks I'm willing to accept, she interrupted gently, not because some ancient prophecy demands it, but because I've come to care for you, for this realm, for the possibility of a future neither of us expected to find. Isn't that worth the risk, Malachar? Isn't that exactly the kind of vulnerability your curse was always meant to challenge you to embrace? He studied her carefully, searching for any trace of doubt or hesitation, finding instead only quiet certainty and genuine affection that had grown slowly, naturally across the months since fate first brought them together. If we do this, he said finally, there will be no path back to what we once were. Your humanity, my isolation, everything about our separate existences will be forever changed. Then let it change, she said simply. I would rather face an uncertain future beside you than retreat into safety that leaves us both alone. The ritual, when they finally performed it beneath the light of a rare, clear night sky, was far simpler than either of them expected, requiring not elaborate spellwork, but simply their combined willingness to accept the bond fate had woven between them from the very beginning. Usald guided them through the ancient words, her voice steady despite the historic significance of what they were undertaking, while the mark upon Malachar's chest blazed brilliant crimson, mirrored suddenly by a similar mark that appeared upon Illyria's own skin, binding their fates together in ways far deeper than mere prophecy had ever suggested. The transformation that followed was neither violent nor overwhelming, but rather a gradual, profound shift, as centuries of accumulated curse finally began unraveling from Malachar's bloodline, replaced by something entirely new. Illyria felt her own nature shifting alongside his, human warmth remaining at her core, yet strengthened now by abilities that would allow her to stand beside him not merely as a companion, but as an equal partner capable of sharing the burdens his crown had always demanded. In the months that followed, Vorithkeep transformed alongside its rulers. The court, initially uncertain how to interpret such unprecedented change, gradually came to recognize the strength found in Malachar's newfound openness, a strength that inspired loyalty far more genuine than the fear his predecessors had relied upon for generations. Even those who had once supported Keith's rebellion found themselves drawn toward this different model of leadership, one that acknowledged vulnerability not as weakness, but as the very foundation of true, lasting strength. Illyra, for her part, embraced her transformed existence with the same quiet determination that had first drawn Malachar's attention months before. She learned to navigate the complexities of demon court politics, bringing a perspective shaped by her human origins that gradually softened old prejudices, building bridges between two realms that had remained divided for far too long. Years later, as Malachar stood once more upon the highest balcony of Vorith Keep, watching the horizon where lightning still occasionally flickered without rain, he found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The crown he wore no longer felt like the crushing weight it once had, transformed instead into something he carried willingly, supported by the presence of someone who had chosen, against all expectation, to stand beside him rather than against him. Illyra joined him quietly, her transformed nature evident in the subtle strength now woven through her every movement, though her essential warmth remained entirely her own. "Regrets?" she asked softly, echoing a question she had posed many times since that fateful night when they first completed their bond. "None," Malachar answered, as he always did, though the certainty in his voice had only deepened with each passing year. "Fate bound us together long before either of us understood what that binding would truly mean, but I have come to believe it was never a curse to fear, nor a burden to resent. It was simply the path toward becoming who we were always meant to be." Together, they watched as dawn slowly broke across the transformed horizon of the Shadow Realm, its once perpetual darkness now touched by streaks of gentle light, much like the realm itself, and the hearts of its rulers forever changed by a bond that fate had woven and choice had ultimately completed.